Hello and welcome to the Wigtown Book Festival. I'm Marjorie Lotfy and I am the chair of the Board of Trustees here, but also the founder and a co-founder and director of Open Book, a reading charity across Scotland, quite different from your Open Book here in town. Welcome to this event, which is Nadifa Mohamed's wonderful The Fortune Men. We're going to be discussing that with her this morning. Is it lunchtime? This afternoon. Soon it's going to be afternoon. The format of today's event is that I'm going to introduce Nadifa, and then we're going to have a bit of chat, a couple of questions about the book before we get to hear her read, which is always my favorite part because it doesn't involve my voice. And then we'll have a few more questions and a bit more chat between us before we open up the questions to you, which I'm hoping you've brought with you today. And also to those of you who might be watching online, I hope you've got your questions ready. So a quick introduction to Nadifa before we get, to her before we get started. She's a Somali British novelist. She doesn't really need this introduction. I'm sure you all know who she is, but she featured on Granta magazine's Best of Young British Novelists in 2013, and in 2014 on the Africa 39 list of writers aged under 40 with potential and talent to define future trends in African literature. She's written lots of other things in addition to this book, as well as a couple of other books before now, but she's written short stories, essays, memoirs, and articles in lots of places, including The Guardian and a particularly wonderful poetry anthology, which I enjoy as a poet, called New Daughters of Africa. This novel, The Fortune Men, the one we're going to be discussing today, has been shortlisted for the 2021 Booker Prize, which we're all rooting for, making her the first British Somali novelist to get this honor. Welcome, Nadifa. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Marjorie.
We're really looking forward to chatting about this book. I just wanted you to start us off talking a little bit maybe about how you came to write it, because it's a true story, which I think we'll get into, but how did the idea come to you? How did you come to this particular story?
It was in a newspaper a long time ago, almost 20 years ago, that I first found out about what had happened to Mahmood Mattan. So it struck me then as a very interesting story, this man who was the same age and background as my father, who'd been executed in Cardiff in the 1950s. That instantly struck me as being something important. But it was only over many years that it came together as a novel. And the more research I did, the more I realized that it was a story that I had to write, that I didn't have much choice about.
Tell us why you felt you had to write it. Was it just something that grew in you, or how did you have that sense? I'm curious as a writer how that develops.
I think you develop a relationship with your characters. They become more and more real to you, more and more alive. Mm-hmm. And Mahmood definitely became that. I think that rather than being the sort of quite naive victim of a miscarriage of justice that I'd expected him to be, he was actually a much more edgy, difficult, rebellious figure than I'd expected. And that was more interesting.
Yeah.
The fact that he wasn't perfect, and the fact that he had a temper and had been drifting in this way for a little while before all of this happens to him, made me think that there's a story here that hasn't been told to my knowledge. Partly the fact that it was post-war Britain, Cardiff, but then also that kind of character as well that Mahmood presents.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's definitely one of the things I want to dig into in a little minute. But before we get to that, can I just ask you about the process of writing fiction around a true story and your thinking around kind of coming into that character and I presume you're having to embellish or having to, in your own mind, create parts of those characters, or how much of that is structured on what you were able to find out?
Well, my gut desire is always to be as close to what happened as possible, as close to reality as possible. And with this case, because it was in the National Archives, it was a pretty well-known and important case. There was a lot of information. There was the newspapers of the time. There was, the police statements, the court transcripts. There was a lot of material.
Yeah.
But they all presented an official view or a very external view of Mahmood. So I think that's what I was trying to avoid. I took on what they said he said or did, but there was a person there that I think they didn't see clearly. They didn't want to see clearly. And that's who I was grasping at. And I found it really helpful to talk to old Somali sailors who had known him or had lived a similar life to him. It was in those nuances and also the cultural aspects, what he would have thought when it came to religion when he was in prison, how he would have kind of put himself at some sort of peace with what was going on, or if he even could, the struggle that involved. That was really interesting to me. And so embellish, it doesn't feel like the right word.
Okay.
But there's a relationship and an engagement, a two-way engagement that happens where you're listening, but you're also talking to those characters.
And I feel as a reader, there's an understanding there coming from you as the author about the culture that you are able to, my background is Iran and having come out of Iran. And when I read things around Iranian characters, for example, I feel like there's something I get there that maybe other people don't, or I suddenly find myself nodding at things. And my sense is that you as a writer know much more about what we would have read in those transcripts, for example, and can fill in, or hopefully have filled in for us.
Yeah, he's from the same hometown as me. My father knew him. There were lots of these connections that made him very tangible to me. Someone that, we wouldn't be friends, but I could understand him. I could care for him. Yeah. And the Somalis, to their credit, the people around him, they were not close in many respects to Mahmood, but when he needed help, they paid for his legal representation out of their own pockets. He was entitled to legal aid, but they didn't want him relying on legal aid. So despite being very impoverished sailors, many of them out of work, they still paid for his barrister and his solicitor. And I found that really touching, and it made me think about the different ways I've seen the Somali community help each other.
Actually, when you come to that, I was surprised at that point in the book, and I don't know why, because culturally that would probably be true of my people as well, but that conversation of we don't want you to have a legal aid barrister was a shock to me as a reader, which I think shows how long I've been here, but also, but also that idea that, we want you, and it wasn't, my memory from it, correct me if I'm wrong, it's been a little while since I've read that bit of the book, but they don't necessarily think that the barrister is going to do a better job in particular, except that he might not hang. He got someone off from hanging, but not necessarily got someone off.
Yes.
It's a pride thing almost, yeah.
It was, I think it was, and a distrust of free things. If something is free, especially for someone like Mahmood, it's likely to be inferior. Yeah. So let us pay top dollar and see what we can get.
Yeah, absolutely. Can we come back to the character before you read a little bit from us? This idea that he's, what I took away from it very early on was that he wasn't necessarily a likable character, and as a reader, I wasn't sure where I was to be with him, if that makes sense. It wasn't a clear, black and white, we feel this way about him or we don't. And that's often true in books, but in this case it felt deeper. It felt like you kept, I don't know whether you did this purposefully, switching our allegiances, so that we never were really sure where we were with him. Was that intentional, or was that just how you felt about him as well?
I think that last year of his life, or the last 18 months of his life, he had changed. And that's what the Somalis who had known him told me, that he had changed. And I can see why. I think the strains and stresses of being a black migrant young man in 1950s Britain, separated from your wife and children, who were the only things kind of making your life palatable, I think, in a very hostile situation, it took a toll on him. And so he was acting out in many respects. And other ways, it wasn't acting out. I think his resistance and anger towards the police was justified. Yeah. They were brutal, and they framed people up all the time. So he knew what they were up to. But I don't think it's an obligation for people in real life or fictional characters to be likable. I think we should all try and act ethically or morally, whatever it might be. But as I get older, I realize that your idea of good behavior can jar against someone else's so much that you are unlikable to them, or vice versa. And especially, I think, when it comes to punishment or people who've suffered injustice, there's a desire to make them unimpeachable. as if, they were an angel or a childlike figure that couldn't have deserved anything like this. But the fact is, no one deserves injustice, however you behave.
Yeah,
And I like that Mahmood was pushing himself, pushing his own ego rather than submitting to anything.
and I think at some points we feel that might be cultural, but actually, as you say, it's much more a reflection of what we see around us. I don't know why we always expect characters to fall in one camp or another. That's what I enjoyed about it. Part of the way through, I found myself thinking, what, did he do it? Knowing full well of the fact, that it's a historical fiction and that we know what happened and we know he was, later it was overturned. But actually there was parts of it I felt where there were enough gaps for me to wonder as a reader, which then made me feel complicit. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Tell us more about that.
When I first read the case files at the archives, National Archives, I became convinced of his guilt, even though I also knew that the case had been quashed much later. Yeah. And I guess it shows you the great fiction that the police put together, that even 70 years later it's able to convince you as a reader. But he was not a good witness for himself. So you keep thinking, so why is he denying that? And why is he saying this? And why won't he say that? And that's one of the things I really struggled with, because that's what allowed me to start believing he could be guilty. And I'm guessing that that's what the jury saw and what other people saw. But he was in jail for 6 months on a capital charge. Separated from anything familiar. He was someone that was very mobile, who loved his freedom, loved his independence. And then to be locked down like that in jail for a crime that he knew he hadn't committed. I think his nerves were fraying by the time it came to court. So he didn't give a good impression on the dock. And it made the police's job of framing him even easier.
I sometimes wonder too. I can see that, and partly too culturally. And I guess I obviously can't speak for his culture, but I can speak for mine. I think what you think is important. I often say to my kids in Iran or Persian culture, truth is a different matter, and it sometimes depends on who. And I know that we all think it's a very clear black and white thing, but it depends on the context in which you're speaking, who you're speaking to, and sometimes it's really clear. You make it really clear in terms of the way he thinks about what he needs to reveal. I didn't need to tell you that because it wasn't important to that conversation. Whereas in our law-keeping kind of police way of thinking about things, yes, that's an important piece of information, but I think it shows up the cultural divide, which is that he doesn't think it's important often.
And he's also very protective about things he wants to keep private, including his family. So he could have said, I was outside my wife's door, which was the case. He was there at the time of the murder, and his mother-in-law had seen him, his wife had seen him, so he had an alibi. But he was so aggravated at the idea of talking to the police, of all people, about his family life, that he wouldn't allow it. He was like, no, you have no right to ask me about my family or about my wife or about any conversations I have with my wife. Yeah. Which you just sort of think, oh, come on. Just let it go and tell them what they need to hear or what the jury needs to hear. But he couldn't, and he was proud like that and stubborn.
Yeah, and when you say it like that, we all are with him, I think, thinking it's understandable that this man doesn't want the police or the public involved in his unusual affairs with his wife, or the fact that he's trying to get her back and having to go visit her at another place.
And he doesn't trust them, which is understandable. He knows that everything so far that he's told them hasn't worked to his benefit, so why tell them even more about his private life?
Yeah, which I can see as well. And let's come back to, I want to talk about that system of justice and the idea that he seems to trust in it a little bit. But before we go any further, for those of you who haven't read any of the book, I wonder if you might read us a little bit of it, just to give us a flavor of what we've been talking about so far. We've gotten carried away, apologies.
So I'll introduce one of the characters we haven't spoken about yet, and that's Diana, who is the murder victim's sister. This is an introduction to her world. There is a buyer interested in the property, a hardware merchant from Newport who is trying to drive down the price by a quarter. Diana will probably agree, but feels no obligation to be quick about it. He keeps calling Daniel, telling him to make her see sense, which makes her delay even more. He thinks that because there was a murder in the shop, he should get a discount, that he's doing her a favor by purchasing it at all. To him, it's just property, but all of her history is tied up in its bricks and mortar. Her father had bought the building in 1909, first number 203, then later number 204, knocking them through to create one large shop. He had enough money left in the bank to hire a maid and to commission a large oil painting of the girls dressed like czarinas to hang above the dining table. Diana's earliest memories are of exploring the maze of 9 rooms upstairs and looking down at the carnival life of Bute Street from the sash windows. A parade of hulking great Vikings with blonde beards and ripped shirts bloodied from brawls, of Salvation Army bands looking for drunks to save, of robed Yemenis and Somalis marching to celebrate Eid, of elaborate funeral corteges for the last of the rich captains of Loudon Square, of Catholic children clad in white on Corpus Christi, led by a staff twirling drum major, of makeshift calypso bands busking to raise enough money to tour the country, of street dice games descending into happy laughter or nasty threats, of bird-like haws preening their feathers to catch a passing punter. What an education for a young girl it had been. Safe too, safe enough for Violet or their mother to stroll alone to the bank every week with hundreds of pounds in takings stuffed into a handbag. Old, malign Tiger Bay, as tame as a circus lion. But she has decided to leave it all behind, to leave the bay and never return.
Oh, thank you for that. Let's talk about this family, because this is the family I recognize, you know, the kind of good migrant family that have come and done well. And how did you get into them, you know, as a kind of subject and as characters? How did you create them and as the opposite in some ways? Although we don't want to think of them as opposite. I don't, but yeah.
Yeah. So they're based on the real family, the Volpert family as it was. And I didn't expect for them to take up so much of my imagination or the novel. And the more research I did, the more interesting they became, the more unusual they became for their time. And also an interesting counterpoint to Mahmood. Yeah. I think they were seen as the good immigrants, and he was definitely the bad immigrant. Their father had arrived from Russia with hardly any money and had built a successful business over time. The sisters spoke good English, were literate. One of their daughters, Grace, is about to apply for a private school. So they're on that journey up the social ladder. And the one thing that's unusual about them is that because of various tragedies and events in their lives, it's 2 women living together with this little girl. And they had decided to live independently like that. So Violet has her shop and Diana has her own business, and they're very happy. They're a very happy little unconventional unit. And then this awful murder takes place in their home, in the shop where they lived, and destroys everything. And I think before then they'd had tragedies that they'd somehow managed to get over. But then this is the one that's so final, so shocking, so intimate. And I found myself really identifying with them in many ways, that they were women of my age. I have that experience of maybe being simultaneously both the good immigrant and the bad immigrant. Yeah. And yeah, the same age that Grace was applying for this private school or preparing for the exam, I was doing the exact same thing. So there was a real familiarity to their story that pulled me in deeper and deeper.
Yeah, me too, exactly. I left home or left Iran at a very young age and arrived with very little, and my family comes from that kind of family. So I really recognize that. Work hard, get your head down. You know, there's no, you must fit in, especially, well, where I landed in America, you must fit in. There's no, you know, I was really delighted to hear that they were still very much a unit with their culture, and they still had connections within their own community within Cardiff, which I think is, which is terrific. But they do seem set up within the community as much more accepted and much more part of things. But there was a part of me that felt like they were still separate. You know, they were still the other.
Yes. I think they were. You know, I think they probably were looked upon as slightly askance because they were unmarried. Diana was widowed,
Yeah.
which many women were, but she was young enough to have got remarried if she wanted to. And I guess the expectation would have been, she's got a small child, she should get remarried. Of course, that's a sensible thing to do. And Violet had never got married. She was someone dedicated to her business. She had a disability. She had scoliosis. They were not very religious. I think they were not in the general stereotype of what a good Jewish family looks like.
No, yeah.
Or what the right kind of Jewish family looks like. So, and I think being in Butte Town, where other families, if they'd made their money, enough money, they would have moved out by then. But the sisters had stayed in Butte Town, which was seen as, you know, a bad part of town, somewhere that if you were well off or climbing up the social ladder, you would move out of it at the soonest opportunity, and they hadn't. And I wonder if also there was a sense of, well, of course it would happen to them because they were just women living by themselves. They should have known to have a man to look after them. Yeah. All of those patriarchal ideas, I think, were the ones that I was thinking of as Diana tries to pull her life back together after the murder.
Yeah, but even the little bit that you read, it feels like a glittering portrayal in some ways of this kind of melting pot. But, you know, she's still looking at it outside a window. You know, she's still somewhat separate from it, doesn't necessarily feel a part of it, even though she's safe in it.
And that seems more true, actually, of Violet, who was the 41-year-old woman who was killed in the shop. And she didn't have many friends on the street. She was quite alone. She didn't really ever leave the shop, while I think her sister did. So that whole, you're part of Butte Town, you're part of Tiger Bay, but you don't also have close relationships to the people around you. I think that was the dynamic that they were in.
And there's a bit in the book where she's holding on to a bit of cloth for something in the future that never happens, you know, and she finally gives it to the next generation. And that, I really relate to that. I think any immigrant's child would, that idea that you just work hard and keep your head down with the hope that the next generation will get, you know, something. Of course, it's cut short here. But one of the things I wondered about, and I think is a natural setup, and I wondered if you struggled with it, as you say, sometimes being the good immigrant and sometimes being the other side, that the facts themselves kind of set you up to have to pit these two families almost against each other in this book. It feels like you're holding one up and then the other in a way that may not feel, well, we know, as you say, we can be both, but not necessarily in this story.
We are often both, and you know, the anti-Semitism that was rife in the 1950s meant that you could be as good as you wanted to, but still be excluded just because of who you were. And I think that's what Mahmood kicks against is that it doesn't matter how good he is. Before, you know, the last 18 months, he had been respectable, whatever that means. He'd gone to work, he'd gone from one kind of awful job to another, limited every time he tries to look for a job by the ones that would employ black men. And, you know, you go to the street, you're dressed up, you look fantastic, the Somali sailors. And I think a lot of the black and foreign men generally, they dressed to impress constantly as a way of asserting their own humanity, their own dignity. And you go out and you look fantastic. And instead of being respected, someone will just throw something in your face or hit you. So that, I think that indignity and that humiliation was enough to make him throw to the side any desire to be seen as a good immigrant. It was almost an unachievable goal, so why bother?
And I recognize that in my own family in some ways. I've recognized that a series of uncles, say, that have come across the water, you know, some will really just get their head down anyway and work and try and ignore that, and some won't. And that, in this case, it feels like it's terrible timing, and it ends at him in the wrong place at the wrong time, as it were, or certainly not in the wrong place, but everybody thinks he was. Whereas often it's just a matter of character. You know, by the time I got to the end of this book, I was thinking, this is a character. You know, this is not an expected character, but a fully rounded man. You know, that has sort of all of these things in him. The person who wanted to work hard, who feels sorry. It's someone that we've created as a culture in some ways by not responding. I don't know if that was your intention, to let us see him grow through that period, kind of. Well, certainly the flashbacks give us a better sense of where he's come from. Yes, and his background is similar to my father's, but also very different. They're from the same home city. They'd both crossed Africa to join the British Merchant Navy. They were pretty much the same age.
But then Mahmoud's family background, was very different to my father's, and he had a much more stable upbringing.
Yeah.
His father owned a shop or shops and had lorries, and in Somaliland of the 1920s and 30s, it was a small group of people that had those kind of resources. He was the youngest of 4 children, and I got the sense of him being someone who'd actually had a probably quite easy life. And he's throwing himself into trouble. He's seeking out trouble with the expectation that he can always get out of it. Either he'll save himself or someone else will come and save him. While my father had a much harder life, where he was raised by just a very young single mum. His father had died when he was 10 years old in a different country. So my father's risk assessment, to use a very modern term, was completely different and kept him safe. While I think Mahmoud just kept pushing the boundaries. And it was interesting to watch a video with his wife, Laura, made in the 1990s as they were trying to clear his name, where she says that sometimes she thinks that he forgot he was black.
Yeah.
Meaning that he forgot the parameters that he was meant to be kept within. And he kept trying, he wanted to go out there, he wanted to live there, he wanted to work here. All of the things that he was meant to not have, he wanted, including her.
Yeah. Let's come back to Laura, because I want to ask you about her, but I want to go back to this idea that he had a completely different upbringing. Because again, I was surprised when I got to that part of the story that his mum was still looking for him. That he, because we expect a migrant story to be different. We expect it to maybe be more similar to your father's or others that we know, that it's hardship or war that you be fleeing from, that you have to do this, and you're the one, as many in my family, were working hard and sending part of it back home, and and that's maybe the reason that people. I keep trying to fit these into nice little narrative boxes, but he's not one of these characters.
No,
he doesn't.
And
he doesn't need us.
I think he doesn't, and I think that those uncomfortable realities, where I think Mahmoud was fleeing comfort more than fleeing hardship, and people do that. And I know people in Somaliland right now who are definitely not poor. They have average, safe, middle-class lives, opportunities, and yet they still do that really terrifying crossing across the Sahara and Mediterranean. And rationally, you can't explain it. But there's an emotional reality to it that maybe you have to live that life to understand. I haven't lived that life, so I struggle to understand it. But people do flee what looks like maybe a flat life, a life where everything is expected, predictable, boring, unsatisfying, too constrained, whatever it might be. And that's just as much of a push as extreme poverty.
Yeah, of course. And there are narratives in those places that we don't know and we don't understand. So there's always, often there's always a carrot or a story about life in, another place, and so we don't know necessarily what the draw is. But I think growing up in those places, often there is an alternative that is dangled, and nobody's clear about why they're crossing. Well, some people are clear because they have no other option, but some people are, coming for
it's murkier.
Yeah, and there's a narrative there. But I think what eventually joined the dots for me was some of his behavior maybe linked to that past, as you say. He's braver, he's pushing because I think he has a safety net in ways that maybe Violet's dad didn't, for example. If maybe there wasn't an option for him.
There's a term that I encountered, first of all, at university studying politics, and it's relative deprivation. That revolutions often come from not the poorest people in society or the ones that are most hard done by, but the ones that have just enough to feel cheated. So they feel a relative deprivation in comparison to someone just maybe slightly above them in that social order, and they're willing to change the whole social order to feel like they're getting more than they have. So maybe there's an element of Mahmoud feeling that relative deprivation, that he feels that these men are his peers, these Welsh men, white men on the ships, on land, they're his equals. So why on earth is he entitled to less than them?
And there doesn't seem to be a moment where he eventually relents. I think, in fact, I found it, maybe I shouldn't have admit this, but I found it amusing that he starts to thieve the people that kind of annoy him or that he feels are putting him down. That's where it begins, not necessarily out of necessity, but just he starts to lift things from people that have been rude. And I think part of me, a little part of me thought, yeah, go for it, which is, and then you think, oh no, I've just, in my head thought that's a good idea. But you can see it's more of a character thing.
And it's an emotional thing. It's not a rational thing. If you were making a kind of rational choice about whether the risk of stealing that handbag was worth that small pleasure, but it's beyond that now. It's in the realm of your deepest ego and your sense of self and your sense of being hurt by this woman's horrible look at you, this degrading look that she gives you. And I do understand that. I get it. I haven't done it, and I wouldn't bother doing it. But that feeling of how dare you.
Yeah.
And wanting, if everyone thinks you're bad, it's often said about young people, if everyone thinks you're bad, you will be bad, because that's the way you start to see yourself as well.
Yeah, so there's a great moment where it's not a great moment, it's a terrifying moment where someone is worried about having her handbag stolen, and that's in fact the very first thing he does, the very first, I'm not sure it's the first crime he's actually committed, but the first one we're kind of acknowledge, that first theft, because he's acting on that expectation, which is that worrying spiral that, as you say, if someone thinks you're bad, you do become bad, and it gets worse. So
yeah, and you see it here, where a very small 13-year-old black schoolboy can get on a bus, and there's a shiver, and I see him as someone who looks like my nephew or someone completely unthreatening, but he's entering a space where enough adults treat him as if he's threatening that he will notice that, he will feel that. And then how do you create your sense of self? Are you threatening? No, you're just a small boy going to school or coming home from school. But your laugh, your size, your face, your skin suddenly becomes an emblem of something else to these people.
And you writing this book, was it striking to you how relevant it still is, in those sorts of contexts? Because it feels a very modern book, even though it's set, many years ago. We'd like to think it's even many more years ago in Wales. It feels like...
No, it feels very real, very contemporary to me. And that's why, I can feel Mahmood as a very alive character, because much of what he experiences, he could still experience right now.
Yeah, it feels like it could absolutely, perhaps not the justice system, so we'll get to that in a second, but, I think, let's hope not. But everything he experiences on the street, yeah, we'll come back to that. But everything he experiences on the street and with his wife and with his boys feels like it could happen in any number of places in Britain or America or anywhere else, which is why it's chilling to read, I think, in lots of ways.
Yes. I think there have been improvements across the board, so now all interviews are recorded. They have to be recorded. So that would avoid, some of the omissions that the police clearly, I think, allowed themselves. There's better forensics. All of these general improvements in the criminal justice system would have helped Mahmood. But the discrimination aspect of that institutionalized racism has not changed. So that's evident in the numbers of young black men stopped and searched. If they are charged, how many of them are convicted, the sentences they get once they're convicted, all of it. If we still had the death penalty, those inequalities would be present in the death penalty as well. So that side of it has not changed. And I think the police that were active in the 50s, some of them would have only resigned in the 80s. And then the people that started in the 80s are maybe only recently leaving the service. So that cultural change has not shifted. It's not shifted. And despite the McPherson report and various other things, there's this feeling that we've done enough. Now leave us to be the police, and the police are entitled to be prejudiced. It was based on all sorts of different prejudices about the poor, about foreigners, about mentally ill people. All of those things, I think, are still intact.
Yeah, I think a lot of what's out there shows that, and the trouble is that they're also then working with a public that still has, like it or not, a lot of these ideas in their head. So, some of the testimony feels like it could read off a page today. No, I saw that man. But when you read back, a lot of the witnesses were saying that he had a mustache, he had a gold tooth, all these things that were just completely not true of this character. Yeah, but the reality is...
Or that he wore white trousers. Who would do anything in white trousers?
Yeah. So lots of it didn't connect, but the really important thing was that he was a Somali. That was it, really. The only thing that hung together. And you feel like that could be true today. So even if you... clear the racism through the police, which I'm not sure could happen or has happened or we're not working hard enough on. The problem is a lot of the testimony that we're relying on is still embedded in our kind of communities today. So that's
and I think that the police represent or reflect wider discrimination. You know, they're not the sole hub of it. They are from us, and they represent what people generally believe. You know, they have a lot of support for stop and search and various other things.
Yeah. Let's talk about the part of the book, because a big chunk of the book does happen in the prison system and in the judicial system. And the barrister I was really interested in that character, because I couldn't make up he was trying. I felt like in some points, and maybe that's what you wanted me to feel, that he was trying his best to get through, but he was also dealing with a cultural divide, really. He couldn't work out why he wasn't telling him what he needed to know. And then he would kind of back off. Yes, sorry, the solicitor. Yeah, and then he would back off thinking, oh, I've tried hard enough, you know, and then he'd come back again. And in many ways, I really appreciated the roundedness of these characters, because he was very human. And I didn't dislike him in the way that I wanted to dislike him.
Yes, and I think it would have been too easy and too crude to make him a terrible solicitor who doesn't do anything and even facilitates the police's work. He doesn't do that. You know, he does enough. He does what he should do. There's no real empathy between him and Mahmood, but he treats him as if, you know, he's a client who deserves his professionalism. But Mahmood was also a difficult client. I think that's what I wanted to get across, is that you have a solicitor who is going through the motions, and then you have a client who doesn't understand the danger he's in, and that also contributes to Mahmood getting this guilty conviction. And then you have the barrister in court who's pretty terrible. Like, he's good as a barrister. He goes through the motions as he should. But then all of this strange stuff about Mahmood being a semi-civilized savage and a half-child of nature and a childish liar, this incredible attack on his own client takes place. And it was telling that this particular barrister had used the exact same language in another trial involving another Somali the year before, calling him also a semi-civilized savage and a half-child of nature. So this was his go-to when he had black clients.
I remember absolutely, I was listening to that part of the book and just stopping what I was doing, thinking, what is he saying? Because the other thing that I should admit now is that I have a lawyer background, although I was never in court. But I was thinking, what is he doing? You know, but actually, in some ways, maybe he's thinking that's the best argument, that even if you don't believe what he said, let me tell you as a white person that you should trust. And that was a really interesting power play. So at one point in this story, the barrister says, just forget everything he says, even if he doesn't know what he's saying. Let me tell you what you've heard. Let me explain. And I thought, what a really interesting power. We're once again being told, based on what actually happened, who has the power in this room, you know, to speak.
And Mahmood would have been standing right there. That's the terrifying thing, listening to all of that.
Yeah, and what's remarkable is that, you know, in what Mahmood speaks, is it 7 languages, and a huge number of different languages. He's traveled...
5.
5. He's traveled all over the world, you know, and in fact, in many ways is so much more worldly and so much wiser than any of the people making these decisions, and yet he's cast as, let's not listen to him, he's not reliable, which I found stunning as a modern reader, a modern listener.
It is, and it was reprinted everywhere. Those lines from the court were in the press at that time. So I think even then, in the 1950s, they were a bit shocking. Yeah. People had these ideas about savagery and the other and all of the rest, but to see them heard, to hear that said so bluntly in a courtroom by the barrister, not even the prosecution, but the defense barrister saying that, was shocking. So it followed all of the coverage of Mahmood's trial from then on. And I guess that's what Britain was trying to unpick, was who are these men that are entering our shores? Mahmood arrived a year before the Windrush did. And so suddenly in Cardiff, in London, in Liverpool, in Leeds, all of these young black men were appearing. And the colonial idea were that they were savages, and that they were savages that you would wipe out to civilize Africa. And yet here they were marrying your daughters and working beside you in factories and things. And the Mau Mau insurgency was going on at the exact same time. So this idea of, are they like us? Are they citizens? Are they British? Or are they these colonial savages that we need to deal roughly with? There was that tension, I think, that the barrister was touching on.
And it's clear that I think it's the latter at that point, that is the general sentiment, that is something, we need your work, but we don't want you, we need to keep you quite separate. So, understandably, for him, he's infuriated by that reaction. And I love Laura, I love the wife's character, her sort of sense of strength. I don't know how much of that you got out of the real person, or whether she had to have been that person in some ways to have done the things that she did.
Well, in a way, actually, Laura is the one who's spoken for herself the most out of everyone, because she had so many interviews in the 1990s when she was campaigning to clear Mahmood's name. She left a lot of material with the Criminal Case Review Commission, who are the people set up to review these miscarriages of justice. So I have a very intimate sense of her life because she told us about it. And you can see her on camera in these video interviews. You can hear her voice. And she seems incredibly strong in that tough, working class woman, in the way of women who had gone against everything they were told to do by marrying these foreign men. You couldn't afford to be weak. Once you'd done that, you couldn't be weak ever again. And I find it...
I was going to say, she is I think in many ways she becomes my favorite character, because, you just want her to succeed. You want her to keep going. And I was going to ask you how she got on afterwards. So it sounds like she didn't crumple, that she carried on being herself.
She did.
Okay.
She did crumple. And I think for a long time she fell apart. But then she put herself back together. And so she tried to clear his name a few times. Once, I know, in 1969, after the chief prosecution witness, Harold Cover, was found guilty of attempted murder of his daughter. And then she finally managed to clear Mahmood's name in 1998, after a campaign lasting a few years, when she was very sick and elderly, but it was her life's it was the one thing she needed to achieve in life. And she did it. And it's incredible that she was the woman, she was the person who managed to get the British state to admit to a miscarriage of justice for the very first time.
Wow, that's stunning. Yeah, I love the way that she goes against her family, she goes against everyone, and then she sort of manages to get everybody back on side in some ways. Even, she goes against him at some point by moving away, and then she's got him back in. And she's very young in this story, isn't she, at some point?
She's incredibly young. She's 21 when he's executed.
With 3 boys, yeah.
Yeah, one after the other.
Yeah, so, I love the way that you describe her, and I love that sort of spunk that's required to kind of live. It's incredible bravery from a woman of any age, but let alone a 17 or 18-year-old to go off and do this. And then to come back in, and to ask the community to support her and her family, I recognize that a lot. I'm conscious of time, and I feel like I should ask all of you if you've got questions as well, but I've got a list of them here. So I'll maybe ask you one more while you're thinking of your questions, or any questions for anyone out there listening. I think we could keep on chatting forever. One of the things I wanted to ask you about was the religion, the point of religion in the book. How he has such an interesting relationship with it, and how you came to write about it and kind of know about it, because he seems to come in and out, and at the end come back to it, and to the very last words, really, of the book. Can you talk us through that?
Well, maybe one thing that led me in that direction was reading an account of the execution by a prison warder who was there.
Oh, okay.
It was written in Welsh, and I read the English translation of it. And he describes Mahmood as saying this kind of gobbledygook at the end. And it was written in this way that made no sense. And I thought, was it Somali? What was he saying? What was he trying to communicate in that moment? And I realized that it was probably it was the Declaration of Faith in Islam. It said in Arabic. And I thought, that really, really got me, because I could hear him saying that. And then he was surrounded by men who didn't know what he was saying and didn't care. Their job in that moment was to put him to death, and nothing he could have said. So there he's speaking to God. That's the only one he can talk to in that moment. And I think, Somalia is a very religious place even now, maybe even more so now than it was in the past.
Okay.
So you were really raised with this sense of God watching you, being present, being judgmental. And also, I think, if you are alone like that, especially if you're Mahmood, in the end sees himself as a stranger in a strange land, that God is the only company you have left. So that complicated relationship, and he said it a lot in the interviews he had with the prison doctors as well, that he's got faith in God. You know, God is listening, God is watching, God is going to get him out of the situation. And of course he'd think that. And I think when we're all in extremis, we can think like that. We have to think like that. And then as each stage gets worse and worse, of course, Mahmood then has to think, what is happening here? How will I get out of this? And, you know, I think, you know, he thinks a lot about fate. As a gambler, I think you always think about luck. And I think a lot about luck. So what, you know, is God different from luck? Is it, you know, is it a pre-written fate that we're dealing with, or is it something different? How can I change this? So that was something I'm sure Mahmood would have been thinking about.
It's funny because at one point someone says good luck, and he says it always comes back to luck. And I was thinking for me, luck and faith are kind of opposites, you know, but then he does eventually. Really? Yeah, well, I guess everybody's different. Yeah, that idea of, but he's surprised by it because for a while it felt like his faith was in the system. You know, even though he was, you know, kind of totally against what was happening to him, he was absolutely sure it was going to be fine because he had real faith in the British legal system, which is a funny thought to some of us now in hindsight. But I felt like that was almost his faith at first, and it seems to have shifted.
Yeah. And his mind was on the compensation he'd received for being wrongly arrested. So that's, and he had been through the criminal justice system a bit himself with petty things. And he felt that he had been treated fairly in those different situations. So his experience told him, they won't do anything terrible to me. They'll be fair. But they weren't, not with this. And I think now whenever I see a murder, you see that panic in people, in society at large, to get the killer. You just want to get the killer. You want to see a face, you want to see someone in court, you want it all over as quickly as possible. So that's the chief difference between the previous trials he'd been in, where no one really had a great stake in it, to this, where this was a terrifying crime, which had upset, Tiger Bay was seen as a rough area, but it wasn't somewhere where things like that happened, where women were murdered next door to their family for money. So that desire, that very kind of animal impulse to blame someone and to hide them away or destroy them, that's what he was up against.
And he doesn't seem to know it. Yeah, he doesn't. He's surprised when there are people in the galleries at the beginning as well. He doesn't seem to know what he's up against. He seems to think this is going to be just somebody's going to open a book. It's going to be black and white. So he's innocent. He can say where he was. Let him go. Yeah. That's and it seems to shift. Let me see if anyone out here has got questions for us on this book. If not, we can keep chatting. And let me check. No, okay. You've got a few more minutes to ask questions. Oh, we've got one in the back. Please keep your mask on while you're asking the question. It's COVID times.
My question is: it seems you're so invested in this person and writing this book about it. How is it after ending the book? It sounds to me like it must be very complicated to let go and to shift to your next book or your next literary adventure. Could you maybe describe a little bit about it?
You're right, it is very difficult. And I remember when I finished writing it, and I wrote that last fictional scene, and I was just sobbing, uncontrollably sobbing. And it's because somehow, even I thought that there's a way of changing the outcome, the ending. And if there isn't, this is what happened. And you can't wish it away, you can't change it. So he was someone that I cared for, and he is someone I care for a lot. And I actually finished the first draft of this years ago, and then I sat with it for a long time, tweaking, editing, doing various things to it. So it's been with me now for years. And the Booker Prizes meant that I'm talking about it in events like this for a lot longer than usual as well. So I haven't really let go. And the other ideas I have in my mind to move on to are they just have to wait until my brain is emptier.
Yeah, it's hard, especially as you're carrying him with you day to day at the moment, and because they're so relevant to the questions we're asking ourselves at the moment in this world. It feels like it's not a book about a particular story. It's not Henry VIII. We're asking ourselves these questions right now, you know. And for me, the big question about that kind of good migrant versus bad migrant and how it's just not clear is so relevant because it's all over the papers at the moment. Everybody's asking me about my family story or you about your family story. It seems those are the stories we want, and we want to be able to put them in nice boxes. And what you've done for us is make that really unclear, that those stories aren't clear.
And I think you can have Emma Raducanu on one side of the newspaper and then a horrible story about these invading dinghies crossing the channel on the other side of the paper. And you're not meant to make a link between these two types of immigrants or refugees or whatever they are to this society. So I think this is a particularly difficult time to work out how we're meant to feel about living in this country.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, and I'm going to look, there's a question at the front. You can have it. Hang on just a second and the microphone will come to you. There you are.
You're both stressing your immigrant background. You're both stressing Britain. You're both saying that the police and the justice system is corrupt or not perfect. You, madam, are a lawyer. So what is it that draws you to Britain if we're so imperfect?
Well, that's like saying you can't love someone unless they're perfect. You deal with imperfection all the time in every aspect of your life. So it doesn't take an immigrant to say that the British justice system is imperfect. People have been saying that for a long time. And that's why there has been progress, because people have pointed out those. And imperfection is too light a word. There's been corruption, there's been violence, there's been all sorts of things. So I was brought here as a very young child. I didn't choose Britain. I've chosen to stay as an adult. But I'm also allowed as a citizen, as a free person, as an individual, to reflect on this country, my experiences of it, other people's experiences of it. And I think there's a danger that if you're an immigrant, this is the same trope of being the good immigrant, is that you never say anything negative, is that you're kind of here on some sort of sufferance and have to keep quiet. And if that's the trade, if that's the bargain, then that's not one I'm willing to make.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. I would add to that there are lots of people in all these places working towards this same end, to try and make sure that the systems that we all live in, whether it be my home country, America, or Britain, which I've chosen to live in for over 20 years, be fair, be equal. So I don't think it necessarily takes an immigrant to make that point. I think it's important that people here are working alongside or actually leading the charge on that. So
absolutely, and it works the other way around as well, that whatever I discover that I don't like about the UK, I can often find the exact same thing in Somaliland, where I'm from, and think I don't like it there either. And they've recently reintroduced the death penalty, which I think is a terrible situation. And my attitude towards all of these things is one of a universal,
of course,
distrust of authority. Authority has to be questioned wherever you are.
Yeah, and I think it's our job to make sure it is, as writers, as readers, as part of a sort of a modern society, we have to ask those questions, I think, for sure. And in fact, my next question was going to be about his anger in the book, which I think is a really interesting one, because I think we often, as you say, expect migrants particularly, and even refugees to come and not feel angry. That's a lot of the women that I work with in our charity are terrific women, but a lot of the expectation for them is just to be grateful, and they are grateful. We have all been grateful at some point in that position. But in this case, I think it's really interesting to see his anger and to see it be justified, both towards the judicial system, but also in terms of the way he's treated. I don't know if you were really aware of that kind of seething anger that comes through. And how, as a reader, it makes us uncomfortable. Yeah. Okay. And how, as a reader, it makes us sort of weirdly complicit and uncomfortable. That thing of thinking, yes, actually, perhaps there's something there that I need to consider. That's the reaction. But yes.
I think anger is a useful feeling, emotion. I write. There's normally a seed of anger in everything that I write, whether that's about the Somali Civil War or about what happened to my father as a young man across East Africa and the Middle East. And I felt a lot of anger towards the injustice that Mahmood faced in this novel. And I think anger is one of the things that can break us out of an apathy that we all feel when we feel that there's these big forces that we can't do anything about, or that we just have to suck things up in our personal lives in whatever situations. And anger can be the one thing that makes you snap out of that. And yeah, I think that anger is a really good artistic tool.
Something as a reader we all understand, because hopefully everybody's felt anger at some point. So it brings in an empathy, which we suddenly think, I understand why that character's angry, and I've felt it. And so in some ways, it's a way of connecting with a character.
Yeah, I can't imagine feeling anger. I can't imagine someone not feeling anger at all, or in any situation, because I think that would speak to a subjugation that's really, really terrifying. Because as children, if someone wrongs us, we feel anger. We learn as adults to control that anger and to respond in a positive way. But to not feel it at all would be very strange.
Yeah, and on the flip side of that, maybe this is the way to end unless there's another question. I ended up thinking maybe for me this book is about fairness. I don't know if you would think that it is. And unfairness, I suppose, on the flip side. But in the end, I woke up this morning thinking, to me, the book is about fairness in the world, and perhaps how we haven't got there, but I don't know whether that feels like it's right to you.
For sure, and it makes me think about that last letter that Mahmood had the police detective write, scribe for him in his execution suite, and that is a lot about fairness.
Yeah.
And how he thought that Britain was a fair place where he would be treated properly. And his realization a few days from his death is that that's not the case.
Yeah, and the other thing that I loved about that is his insistence that that someone contact his mother, as a mother. Maybe it's because I'm a mother of lots of teenagers, but the idea that, and tell her I went down with a ship, that don't tell her. He doesn't want that story to carry on. He wants her to have a different story, which I thought was very touching. And maybe, yeah.
And that's what his children were told as well, that he died at sea.
Yeah, gosh. Yeah, some fairness or the unfairness of that. I think that's probably us, unless there are other questions. I think we might need to leave it there, if that's okay. What I do want to do is say thank you to Cobwebs, who's our sponsor for today, and thank you to Nadifa for this conversation. I feel like we could carry on this conversation for quite some time. And thank you to you all
Marjorie,
for listening. You can come through because she's not with us today, we are selling the books through this room. I'm looking at the back for a nod. And you can have you have a £5 discount on that book because our author isn't with us today. So we really hope you purchase this beautiful book. And if you're listening to us online, you can also get it on our online bookshop. But thanks for joining us. Thanks to you, Nadifa, and thanks to everybody out there for taking part.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Sorry I couldn't be there.